Okay, cool. So I may be a little bit ambitious with the whole black belt thing in 30 minutes. Brown belt or purple belt's probably a bit more accurate because it was actually 30 minutes it took me to make this rather than deliver it. But anyway, let's crack on. So a little bit about myself, for those of you that I haven't really met before. So I've been in IT just over a decade now. MVP for a couple of years now, focusing on Microsoft security, compliance, identity, all that kind of stuff. I'm the author of a book coming out next year, hopefully the first half of next year. That's still to be confirmed. It's called Mastering Microsoft 365 Defender. Kind of does what it says on the tin, just goes into a whole bunch more depth into the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking to you about today. I'm the co-organizer of the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance User Group, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we meet once a month, usually the last Wednesday of every month, Teams only, so it's an online event, and we cover all stuff, again, to do with security, compliance, identity, and management. And the day job, my paymasters are ThreatScape, so they're my Microsoft Security Solutions Architect, again, getting involved in all sorts of projects, to do with deploying Defender, deploying Purview stuff, a little bit of Intune stuff, but again, the key focus is cybersecurity for me. So I guess I'm going to kick off just so I can know how to shape this thing, just so I can get a feel for where you guys are with Defend for Endpoint at the minute. I guess first of all, just quick show of hands. EDR, is that a term that's familiar with people? Yeah. Kinda, half and half, yeah, mostly. XDR? Kinda, okay, cool. It's a buzzword anyway, it doesn't really mean anything. Out of those folks that are familiar with EDR, who uses Defender for Endpoint? Okay, about half of you. And if you're not using Defender for Endpoint, are you using another third-party EDR or XDR? Maybe you could shout out some names, like who's using Symantec, McAfee? No, nothing? Cool, fair enough. Okay, right. I'll start off by kind of explaining, for those of you that aren't familiar with what XDR is, what EDR is, explaining where Defend for Endpoint sits in Microsoft's ecosystem of a whole bunch of other stuff that's called Defender. So, right, we've got this thing called Defend for Endpoint, acronym MDE. You're going to be acronymed out your nut by the end of this thing, by the way, so just bear with me. You've got another thing that sits in Microsoft's portfolio called Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management. Now, this is part of MDE, but it's big enough that it gets its own acronym and it also gets its own license. But you get part of it with MDE. You've also got Defender for Office 365. The simple way of explaining what that is, it's kind of like your Mimecast alternative. It does a wee bit more than Mimecast in some areas and it does less in others, insofar as clues in the name. It's Office 365, so it extends to Teams, SharePoint, etc. You get Microsoft Defender for Identity. This is focused on securing on-premises Active Directory domain services and federation services. And then lastly, you've got something called Defend for Cloud Apps, previously called Cloud App Security or MCAS, and that's focused on protecting your infrastructure as a service and your SaaS. It's a CASB, Cloud App Security Broker. See what I mean about the acronyms? There's going to be a lot of them. You take all those things and you bundle them into what we call an XDR. So Extended Detection and Response, that's called Microsoft 365 Defender. And whenever you go to security.microsoft.com, which you'll probably have been to before even if you don't use Defender, or at least you don't think you use it, that's the portal. So you can call it the security portal, you can call it the Microsoft 365 Defender portal. It's all the same thing, it's the XDR platform. And basically what it does is it unifies the response for all these things. So it's not perfect yet, but the idea is, when you're doing incident response, you don't want to be jumping between your email security system, back to your antivirus system, back to your SIEM, that kind of thing. Respond in one portal, it makes it a whole lot quicker, and you can apply a little bit of intelligence to it. So, again, we're talking about Defender for Endpoint, and that's our focus here. So what do you get with Defender for Endpoint? I'll break it down into the kind of silos. There's going to be a little bit of marketing fluff here, but I'll try not to go too heavy on the marketing. Next generation protection and firewall. Next generation protection is really just that fluffy term to say a cloud-enabled antivirus. It's providing your basic malware protections. We'll talk about some of the cloud delivered stuff it does, and you also get the firewall that's kind of been built into Windows for several versions of the OS now. You get attack surface reduction. I think in Config Manager this is still called Exploit Guard. That was the old name for it. It's basically a collective term of operating system hardening tools. The most known one, or the most prevalent one of those, is called attack surface reduction rules, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get on. EDR and advanced hunting. So right at the start was about half and half of who knows what EDR is. So just to kind of be explicit, EDR is basically monitoring and spying on tons of stuff that your device does, so that rather than relying on malware signatures, we're looking at, I guess you could say, a wee bit more forensic level information. So we're looking at tasks being created, scheduled tasks. We're looking at child processes spawning, PowerShell scripts being run, basically all that kind of stuff that's happening, hundreds of events per minute. We log all that and then we look for suspicious activity. You can use advanced hunting to build out manual detections, or you can rely on Microsoft's EDR capabilities to kind of pick out the bad stuff for you. Auto investigation and remediation. This is a funny one. This is kind of what I describe as the R in EDR. So EDR is endpoint detection and response. The auto investigation and remediation, that does the response part on your behalf. So that will go away and it will perform some forensic investigations for you. So if it sees something suspicious happening on the device, it will do stuff like kick off an antivirus scan, check for scheduled task entries, all that kind of stuff. Threat and vulnerability management, that's the kind of soft term for the vulnerability management license that I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about some of the cool stuff and you will get with that. It's not called Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection anymore, right? It's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and that's because it protects more than Windows now. It runs all the way from Windows 7 SP1 to Windows 11. Mac OS, they support the last 3 versions. Linux servers, I want to say there's about 7 or 8 server distros that are supported now, basically the most popular ones. It has to be a supported one, otherwise it just won't install. Doesn't support desktops yet for Linux. Android phones and iOS and iPadOS, you can also get some kind of capability. But again, because all these operating systems are so different, you're going to get, we're not getting the same features on all of these, but it's getting closer to that. Okay, right. Licensing, sorry. So SKUs, how do you actually get this thing? There's really 3 main versions that I'll focus on. The first is what's called Defend for Endpoint Plan 2. That's the whole thing, basically. Or at least it used to be the whole thing until they started adding some add-on licenses. I'm going to skip that for the sake of simplicity. You get Plan 1, which is your E3 level of Defender for Endpoint. It's a really crippled version of Defender for Endpoint. It's good they've got Plan 1, but you'll see the slide that shows just how limited it is. And then you've actually got Defender for Business. Now, do any of you guys manage tenants that have got Business Premium licenses? Cool. Business Premium is pretty awesome because it's very cheap, and as long as you're 300 or fewer users, it's incredible bang for your buck. Defender for Business is basically Plan 2, but with a cap of 300 users. There's some things you don't get in it, but you get a lot of it. So, going back to that slide I had up before, with Plan 2 you get all that stuff. With Defend for Business, you basically get all of it minus the advanced hunting. There's a couple other things, like something called threat analytics you don't get, but for all intents and purposes, this is the best value EDR platform that you're going to find out there. And then Plan 1, you get the built-in antivirus, you get the firewall, and you get attack surface reduction, but you don't get any of that advanced hunting or anything like that. It's basically saying, take that built-in antivirus that comes with Windows 10 and manage it from a central place. You don't get any of the cool stuff. Okay, now I really do have to simplify the whole deployment thing because I've only got 20 minutes left. Because it supports such a diverse range of operating systems, you can imagine it gets quite complicated to deploy, in part because it's using built-in stuff in Windows 10, right? So Windows 10 comes with all the agents and stuff already in it. It just flicks the switch, basically. The key thing I want you to know, if you haven't already deployed it, is that it's decentralized. What I mean by that is you're basically going to use your existing management tool to do this stuff. So if you get Intune, you'll use Intune, Config Manager, GPO, all the way down. The order I've listed them then, that's kind of the preference that you should follow. So if you've got Intune, use it. If you don't have Intune, but you've got Config Manager, then use that. I like to recommend folks use this as an excuse to get enrolled in Intune anyway. The reason I highlight this is it's kind of different from a lot of your third-party stuff, right? So like Semantic, you install the Semantic server and you push it all out from there. Not really the same as Defender for Endpoint. There's also two places to configure this stuff. So again, I'll use the Semantic example. You configure everything in the Semantic server and all your clients pick it up. Defend for Endpoint, because it uses these existing management tools, there's a ton of stuff you could go to configure stuff. You could do it in Intune, you could do it in Config Manager, GPO, but you've also got these service settings that you actually configure in the security center. So just to kind of break that down visually, a lot of this stuff, like how often am I going to run scans, some exclusion settings, how often am I going to update, you configure that. Well, best place to configure that is endpoint security in Intune. But you're going to find some stuff that you have to go to the security center to do that. And we'll talk about some of the key settings that I recommend you configure, because out the box, this thing is very poorly configured. The other thing when it comes to deploying you need to be aware of is you get these different running modes, right? So because Defender Antivirus is actually baked into Windows 10 and 11, Microsoft, they can't just say, well, everyone gets this antivirus running all the time, right? So as soon as Windows 10 or 11 detect the presence of a third-party AV, they'll go into something called passive mode. And that basically means it sits there, and through some Windows APIs, it says, hey, well, McAfee is actually your primary AV, purely as an example. The good thing is that makes migrating it really easy, because you can just push it out, and it just sits there doing nothing. You uninstall your third party, and within minutes of that happening, boom, you're protected. So you don't need to worry too much about timings. Right, so deploying to servers. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to this slide. They've kind of changed a lot about this recently, and it all goes back to licensing. If you've got an enterprise agreement, or you're using, let me get this right, I'll need a fact check on it. If you're using Defender for Business and you've got less than 60 servers, you can do it the exact way I just mentioned on the clients. Push it out with group policy or config manager or something, or even a script. If you're doing CSP licensing, you have to use Defender for Cloud. Show of hands here, who knows about Defender for Cloud? A third of you? Cool, okay. What that means is that really changes how you deploy this thing, because if your server isn't in Azure, you have to connect it to Azure, because Defender for Cloud is an Azure resource and it's built based on the time. So that means if you're in AWS or you're on-prem, you have to get the Arc agent out. So just to recap how you get Defender for Endpoint on a server, you have this big capability called Defender for Cloud. Part of Defender for Cloud is Microsoft Defender for Servers. That comes in Plan 1 and Plan 2, and it's hard to say this with a straight face. And then within Defender for Servers, you get Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. So Defender for Servers, just to be clear here, that's what you're buying, and you're build on it like an Azure resource. So for every hour my machine is online, Defender for Servers will bill you for using Defender for Endpoint. Defender for Servers, like I said, it's got Plan 1 and Plan 2. Plan 1 just gets you Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. Plan 2 gets you a whole bunch of other stuff like just-in-time access to a VM. And I didn't deliberately mean to confuse the hell out of you there, but it's just the nature of the beast here. Now, one of the cool things you can also do with servers now is, although Intune is obviously for endpoints, right, you can't enroll a server in Intune, you can still manage it from, I guess, what's now called the Intune Admin Center. You get something called Security Management for Defender for Endpoint, aka Defender for Endpoint Attach. And what it does is it takes those servers that are enrolled in Defender for Endpoint and it'll actually show them in the Intune Admin Center. And you can push out policy that way. You can't push out all policies, but as far as kind of the roadmap of where Microsoft are going to centralize management, that's where it's headed. Okay, cool. Like I said, I'm simplifying the deployment quite a lot there just for the sake of timing and everything. The main thing I wanted to focus on in this session was what are some of the stuff that I don't think are very well documented that folks don't really recommend people do, but you should be doing if you're going to deploy this stuff. The first is something called block at first sight. So I mentioned earlier, you've got that next generation protection, and that's basically your anti-malware platform that's connected to the cloud. Block at first sight is a combination of 3 settings that you're going to configure in Intune group policy or somewhere like that, and it's those 3 settings there. Cloud delivered protection is the first one. Basically what that does is that lets the built-in Windows Defender antivirus talk to the cloud protection service. You then get a cloud delivered protection level, and you can kind of think of that in your head as this dial that you turn to say how much security do I want versus how many false positives do I want. So you get a protection level of high plus, or zero tolerance, and what that kind of translates to is at what level of the threat of this file do I hold it to. So for example, if I go zero tolerance, no executable will be able to run on a Windows device until it's been uploaded to the cloud, sense checked, and then came back down. And it holds it for that time period that you see there. It's actually plus 10 because 10 seconds is built in. So for 60 seconds, you'll stop an executable for running while it's sent up to the cloud, analyzed, and then given a pass or a fail. So zero tolerance means we're going to do that for anything that Microsoft have never seen before based on the hash. Or high, that might say, well, we're not going to do it for everything, but if there's some metadata about this file that makes it look suspicious, then we'll hold it. And high plus is somewhere in the middle. So that's block at first sight. And I deploy Defender for Endpoint all the time, and I rarely see that set up right, and it kind of shocks me. So you need to be aware of that. Tamper protection and disable local admin merge. Okay, local admin merge is kind of it's kind of a hidden one that's not on by default. But basically, you know, if your users have got local admin on their devices, and everyone knows that they shouldn't, but people give them away and it's terrible. Out the box, they could just completely disable this thing, right? And that's not very good, especially if the bad actors get their hand on local admin, because that's what they want. Disable local admin merge basically won't let them change any settings that you've specified in Intune. So for example, if in Intune I'm handling exclusions, it means that a local user can't add exclusions. Tamper protection actually acts as a layer on top of that, and it stops the end user, even an admin, changing anything to do with Defender antivirus. So for example, they can't go in and disable cloud delivered protection, as an example. And you can configure that in the portal here, and we'll talk about some of the ways that it can actually get quite annoying, but what are the ways you get around that. Okay, EDR and block mode, this is another really cool feature. This is really intended for that passive mode that I mentioned. So we'll have a lot of customers who maybe they're paying for E5, but they're not yet ready to roll out Defender for Endpoint. The business has just bought E5 and it's like, well, I've still got 3 or 4 years left on my existing antivirus license. The cool thing about EDR and block mode is you could just push Defender for Endpoint out in passive mode. So it just sits there, not really hogging any resources, but it kind of catches anything that your existing one will miss. So you can kind of think of this as a defense in depth. So the telemetry in the cloud recognizes it. It says, hey, your third party didn't pick it up, so I'm actually going to pick it up. And it does that with kind of minimal performance hit. And again, you configure this in the service settings in the security center. Doing it this way turns it on for your whole tenant. So you set it, and every member of your tenant gets it. And then if you wanted to, you could use Intune to disable it on specific devices. Update hourly. This is again another one I see people misconfiguring all the time. And it's not really just true for Defender, it's true for most antiviruses these days. They kind of like Delta updates. So they would rather update tiny little bits all the time rather than doing one big update once a day. It's quite straightforward in Intune. Basically just, or config manager, whatever you're using, just set it to the minimum of an hour, which is the fastest you can do it. There's some more nuances around updates, but really that's the big one I'd give you. The other advantage to this is, yeah, you're updating more, so maybe you'll be more likely to get a bad update, I can't deny that, but you'll also be more likely, or sorry, quicker to respond to fix that bad update as well. This is one that is definitely under-documented, and folks should be using it, especially in high secure environments, and it's a setting that's kind of buried in there, and it's called Enable File Hash Computation. It rolls off the tongue, that one. So the EDR and the AV component of Defend for Endpoint, they're kind of going to opportunistically or on the fly take hashes of files that are running. When you enable this setting, you're basically saying, well, actually don't do it just kind of on the fly and opportunistically. Actually go away and hit more files and get those hashes. Why do you want to do that? Well, if you set up a block or an allow based on a hash, it just makes the response that much quicker. They say there's a slight performance hit. I can't deny that, but I've rolled it out to, last customer was about a 1,400 seat organization. They just went YOLO, just did it, and there was no dent. So your mileage may vary, but anyway, last time I checked, for some reason this wasn't in the Endpoint Security Blade with all the other antivirus policies, but you can get it in the settings catalog now. This is a really important one, and that's the fact that you can improve the telemetry by changing the audit settings in Windows. So I mentioned earlier that the EDR, it crawls through all your telemetry, basically spying on you, seeing what you're doing, and then saying, hey, this looks suspicious, we should do something about it. Microsoft don't turn all the auditing on for you just by getting Defender out there. You have to go away and turn it on yourself if you want to get even more data. And really, it was another MVP called Olaf Hartong, a company called Falcon Force, I believe. He did a whole bunch of research on this. You can search his blog on Medium, it's really good. But what you're wanting to do is you want to improve in your group policy or in your Intune and your settings catalog. You've got that section called audits. There's a ton of stuff that you can turn on, and you'll get more data that Defend for Endpoint just by default doesn't publish. So maybe the most obvious ones of those are basically firewall failures. That's good for building firewall reports to say, hey, we blocked a website, that kind of thing. But then also stuff like user account management to detect that. That's just a screenshot of some of the settings. I'll send to you, Scott, the link from GitHub if you want to put it up there. But again, if you just Google Olaf Hartong's blog, you can find some great resources he's put together there. The same actually goes for Windows Defender application control. If you put that in audit mode, you get even more stuff as well. And Anthony, in his last session talking about Config Manager, actually hit on this as well, and that's consider the tiering implications of this. So the Security Center, people hand out security admin, global admin, like it's nothing, right? You know, oh, you're a global admin, you're a global admin. The problem is when you roll out Defender for Endpoint, if you start putting that on domain controllers, federation servers, certificate servers, you know, really high risk stuff, and then you go away and you enable this setting called live response for servers, that lets you get a direct terminal session to that server, and I could execute any PowerShell script I wanted on it. So just be cautious of that. Basically what I'm saying is, you do that, all of a sudden, all your security admins are now also domain admins, and they get the keys to the kingdom. Okay, 7 minutes to go, and then pizza. Operationally, what are some black belt practices? Exclusions is a main one that I call out. Exclusion management in Defender for Endpoint is a little bit complicated because it's layered. You've got exclusions in the Security Center, exclusions in Intune, and it just gets messy. I could do a whole session on just managing those. The short version is just be as specific as possible with your exclusions. Don't do a whole folder when you can do a specific file path. Don't do a specific file path when you can just do a file hash. You get the idea. Next tip is kind of think of it as like a crawl, walk, run approach. I know that's a cliche and Microsoft use it all the time, but you can apply that in the form of Defend for Endpoint for audit, warn, then block. Earlier we talked about how you could roll it passive mode, make sure stuff works before you flick that active mode switch. You can do the same with a lot of the settings as well though, actually. So for example, attack surface reduction rules. They're going to really change the allowed behavior on a device. You know, they're going to say stuff like, well, all of a sudden Office apps can't execute child processes. And that's great on paper because that's a common attack surface. But if you ever worked with a finance team, they live for crap like that. So what you can do is you can put it in audit mode. They build a whole bunch of really useful reports to say, hey, here's all the devices and all the processes that would have been blocked. You build up that audits, maybe you add some exclusions, maybe you update some software, yada, yada, yada. And then when you're comfortable with it, okay, well now we'll bump it up to warn mode. And basically what it is it's a block mode with a user override. So the user just gets a little toast notification, and then you can say, okay, allow it for 2 hours, something like that. Then eventually you analyze more data, you're in a comfortable place, then you go full on block mode. So point is, you don't have to rush into this stuff. There are a few of these ASR rules, by the way, that they're turning on by default because they're very low risk. Okay, troubleshooting mode. Earlier I spoke about tamper protection. And tamper protection basically stops you completely turning off Defender antivirus and doing a whole bunch of other stuff that would kind of bypass it. The main people you see that get angry with that aren't IT pros. It's usually people on games forums saying it's slowing down their game and stuff like that. So it's actually consumers that this affects the most. But if you're an enterprise customer, you go to the device in the security center, go to actions, you get all those actions there, but the key one here is enable troubleshooting mode. That pushes policy down to the device for, I want to say it's 2 or 3 hours. And it basically disables the tamper protections. You could then go and turn tamper protection off on using PowerShell, and then you could do stuff like add exclusions, tweak Defender antivirus, and just troubleshoot it in general. After you've done that, it reverts it back. So it takes a snapshot and puts you back to that snapshot so you can make the changes in a proper way rather than just locally on the device. Performance analyzer. Again, talking about troubleshooting, everyone hates antiviruses because they slow stuff down. Performance analyzer is a new tool that kind of helps you figure out what might be slowing stuff down. It records what you're doing and then gives you a report at the end of it. So you jump in, you run a PowerShell command that says start the recording, do whatever you find is sluggish when antivirus is running. It's usually kind of, there's a list of known offender apps. So run that app, stop the recording, go in and look at the report, and then it will say, well, actually, for example, we were doing a file scan, here's how long it took. Therefore, that's the process you need to exclude, as an example. Custom hunting queries. This is where you can really improve on the out-the-box stuff that Microsoft alert you about. So a lot of customers think, well, we'll just deploy Defend for Endpoint and then Microsoft will tell us about all the bad stuff that's going on in the environment. That's not the reality of it. It is very good out the box at telling you bad stuff, but there might be stuff that you want to know that they don't think they'll bother telling you, right? So I mentioned ASR rules earlier. By default, if an ASR rule blocks something, they won't tell you. There's a lot of admins kind of like, I kind of want to know if you're blocking child processes, right? So you can use custom hunting queries. You get a language called KQL, which they spoke about at the last user group, right? That's manifested in a feature called advanced hunting. So you build up these queries that's basically querying a massive database of all that EDR telemetry. And then you can save that and you can run it every hour, every 3 hours, yada, yada, yada. So in this example, this is a modified version of a community query that I've got. And it's basically saying, if anyone runs any of these PowerShell commandlets, let me know, because they're high risk or something like that. What we do is we create that query. We then say create a custom detection. Get it to run every hour. You can choose actions on the back of it. So for example, anything that is a result of this, well, isolate the device, initiate an antivirus scan, a whole bunch of stuff like that. And then you'll get an alert that looks something like that. So you can basically find out, come up with your own suspicious behavior, build a query around it, and then you'll get an alert. Security recommendations. These are great if, again, you've got that passive mode on, because this stuff's just there as part of your license. Also works with active mode, obviously. I really like this because it just makes it easy. It just tells you what to do. Like, you don't even have to think about this stuff. It tells you out-of-date software that you should update. end-of-life software that you should completely uninstall, and then just general insecure defaults for the operating system, which for Windows is a ton of stuff, obviously. So you can just work in here. You can use it as kind of a roadmap. If you're bored, just go in here, tick some stuff off the to-do list. It integrates with Intune. So for example, you could tick, I don't know, uninstall Adobe Flash Player. It'll create a ticket over in Intune as well if you've got different teams managing Defender and managing Intune. Device discovery. This is part of that vulnerability management, but you do get it with Defender for Endpoint Plan 2. It's one of those settings, they turned it on by default, and everyone was like, oh my god, what is going on here? But they turned it on by default because they knew, or at least I think, if they made it opt-in, you would never do it, because it's a bit nerve-wracking. Basically what it does is it probes your network for devices that aren't in Defender for Endpoint. So everyone thinks they know their inventory, and they're like, yeah, of course all our devices are going into Defender for Endpoint. Probably not. The bigger your company gets, the bigger your org gets, the harder that is to manage. So this will basically scan it and say, hey, this device isn't in Defender for Endpoint. You should go away and do it. Also does network appliances, so printers, routers, switches. You can find out vulnerabilities on them based on queries. 2 levels, basic and standard. Standard basically gives you more telemetry, but it's a little bit more aggressive. You can add network exceptions, and it's got some logic in there to avoid home networks, for example. That logic doesn't always work though, so you can add exclusions. Okay, threat analytics. I think this is the last kind of tip with regards to operationally, how do you manage Defender for Endpoint. Threat analytics is so good. It's basically threat intelligence that's behind a paywall as part of your E5 license. It's good reading. Basically what they do is they publish all these analyst reports. You can then go in and you can find out, well, what are the latest threats that are in the news, what are the hardening techniques against those threats, but then also it will give you context about your environment. So for example, I don't know what's playing on the screen there, but this one, it's going to go away and it's going to tell me, hey, here's this ransomware gang, here's how we know they're behaving, here's some of the attack patterns they've used, and here are the devices in your environment that might be vulnerable to it because you've not configured a hardening setting. That kind of idea. Okay, I can see in the preview the next slide is completely out of order, so yeah, there you go. That doesn't look right, does it? Let me just click through all of them and I'll get them on the screen. Okay, a few things if you're going to leave this to go away and do. First off, if you got the license, just push it out in passive mode. Start with a handful of devices. When you're comfortable with it, just keep going and going and going. Even when you're in passive mode, you don't have to quickly move away from your existing platform if you like it, but you'll get all those goodies that I just mentioned, recommendations probably being the biggest one. If you've already deployed it, hopefully some of the tips that I've mentioned will help you. Maybe you've not seen them before. I could probably do another half-hour session on the exact same volume of stuff. I'll see how it goes. The other thing, I guess, I have this discussion all the time with people, and it's not true of just Defender for Endpoint, it's true of any antivirus, any EDR. It's all just little parts of building up your defenses. An antivirus, an EDR, a firewall, they're not going to solve all your security problems. If you're not doing application control, if you're not doing app blocker, basic things like that, then, throw them in your roadmap as well. If you're not licensed, get a free trial. It's pretty straightforward. If you've got an org, Microsoft will give you that free trial. And then the Ninja training will go into a ton more depth than I've done already. Most of you folks probably already know about the Ninja training series they do, but the one for MDE it's really good. So check it out. And 33 minutes, that's not bad. Squeeze that in. So cool, that's me. I'll take questions if anyone's got them, but hopefully you don't. And then you can, if you think of anything, then just hit me up on Twitter. It's probably the easiest way to get me if you want.
Just wondering.
Yeah, go for it.
Have you found in any way clients complaints that your antivirus, when you're trying to cap the CPU usage, the full scan runs at a point during the day, and the client then starts moaning that their CPUs are at 100% using the time?
Yeah.
Does it ignore the cap from it in June?
It doesn't ignore the caps, but it's kind of like average based and opportunistic. Your best route is just to go around the route of using the performance analyzer and creating exclusions, because there will be a reason behind it, right? Out the box, your AV should never be hitting those levels, so there's usually some reason behind it.
Full scan kicked off last week, and a client enabled the machines 100%.
Right, yeah.
Got it capped to 25.
Well, on the point about the full scan, actually, that's a good point. So Microsoft's their vendor guidance is don't enable full scans on a schedule. They say just stick with a daily quick scan and only use a full scan if there's an incident. Exactly. And the logic behind that is basically if you've got real-time protection enabled and you're doing all the stuff I mentioned, like block at first sight, you should be fine anyway. That's easier said than done because people have been doing full scans forever, and there's a little bit of trepidation about that, but that's what they say.
For stuff like CSF, though, so if you have a framework for compliance, it says you have
to do a full scan.
To regulate full scan.
There you go.
So,
Yep.
I suppose that's just the vendor trade-off.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do it. Everyone else is like, do it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know which is right or wrong. I can only say what Redmond tell you to do. Cool. Oh, on you go, mate.
ASR, so you mentioned the method of the kind of advanced hump move to see if anything's triggered on that.
Yes.
Is there another GUI-based method? Is there obviously my client
Specifically for ASR rules?
Yeah, they're getting the kind of threats from USB and kind of share processes. And we're just wanting to see if there's an easier way of the security team to look at that specifically.
Yeah, sure. Let me show you something. Right, I'll stop the recording.